Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Elizabeth Cavell, an Associate Legal Counsel for FFRF, and joining me today are two other FFRF attorneys.
I'm Patrick Elliott, Senior Counsel.
And I'm Sam Grover, Associate Counsel here at FFRF. Today we are going to be discussing school vouchers. So if you have a question for us, you can post it on Facebook, or you can email us at askanatheist@ffrf.org.
At FFRF, we've worked on the front lines to stop the expansion of school vouchers. Both Sam and Patrick have lobbied on this topic before state and federal legislators about how school vouchers are harmful.
So I can explain what we're talking about when we say vouchers. School vouchers come in a few different forms, but the essential premise is the same. Public money that would otherwise be spent on public education or go into the Treasury is instead given to private schools.
And one thing that people need to understand about vouchers is the proponents fully intend to weaken public schools and to prop up religious schools. We have observed this by the policies supported by the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. We've also observed this in states where vouchers have recently expanded. One example, just last month, the governor of Illinois vetoed a public school funding bill and pressured state lawmakers to add a $75 million tax credit program that will largely benefit Catholic schools in Chicago. Cardinal Blaise Cupich, the Archbishop in Chicago, was a chief backer of the bill and was actively involved in the political negotiations. So you can be sure that religion is being benefited when the head of the Catholic Church is orchestrating a state's voucher program. Ultimately, this program will be a windfall for parochial schools under the Cardinal's control.
So this illustrates why state and church are not separate under school voucher schemes. The major beneficiaries are religious institutions. And it's a cornerstone of our secular republic that citizens should not be taxed to support religion. The basis for the First Amendment was Thomas Jefferson's landmark Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which guaranteed that no citizen, quote, shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. And that included religious seminaries. And many state constitutions replicate this wording in their Bill of Rights. And voucher programs violate this core principle, because vouchers not only force citizens to fund and support religious institutions, but also fund and support the actual indoctrination of young students.
So when we have lobbied on this issue, we have pointed out that 90% of students in the U.S. attend public schools. These are schools that are accountable not just to parents, but also to taxpayers. Public schools are managed under democratically elected school boards that assert public oversight. With vouchers, citizens have no means to review school records, attend meetings, or otherwise gather information about school operations or provide input.
And we know that the lack of oversight has proven disastrous in many places where vouchers have been implemented. Milwaukee, Wisconsin has the largest running voucher program in the country. There, more than $139 million in tax money over a 10-year period has gone to Milwaukee voucher schools that were eventually removed from the program for failing to meet requirements related to finances, accreditation, student safety, and auditing. Because these schools are supported with public money, it matters how voucher schools are run. In the Milwaukee program, some schools replace scientific instruction on evolution with religion. Some schools failed to provide any textbook at all. And some schools set up shop in industrial buildings that lacked a safe place for students to play. These are schools that have an immediate negative impact on students.
Vouchers also raise questions about equality in our school system. Public schools must provide a free and appropriate education to all students without regard to religion, sexual orientation, or disability status. Parochial schools are under no such obligation, and most choose to discriminate. Not all students are allowed to attend.
So we've discussed a few of the problems that arise with public funding of private religious schools via these voucher schemes. And now if we have any questions, we can take those. And let's see. Here we go. Tabby La Martina asks, how can we stop this in our states?
Well, it's something that we've been actively working on. Sam and I have both gone to Congress to lobby. In the states, we also encourage people to communicate with their legislators. I don't think they fully know how many people want to support their public schools and really have a problem with voucher schemes. So I think the first thing is being vocal and active. And I observed just even in some of the lobbying that we've done where legislators you might not think are favorable to a voucher position, very conservative legislator, actually is pretty receptive because many people went to public schools, support public schools, and have concerns with turning that public money over where there's not a lot of oversight. So I think people should really get out and reach out to their legislators.
Yeah, it's especially appropriate for legislators to hear from families in more rural areas where voucher schemes will be less effective. It's really tough to have private schools in every small rural community. So this is an issue that affects every area of the state, and I think most state legislators are pretty receptive to hearing from constituents.
So we have another question here, and that's from Amanda S. What does the word voucher even mean? When did vouchers first come into use? I'm not sure if we know the answer to this question, how old these schemes are, but we do see them taking many different forms, more and more creative forms as different state legislatures try and figure out ways to divert public money into private schools, primarily religious schools.
And I mean, I can answer a little bit of, when did they kind of get off the ground, which would be about 1990 in Milwaukee here in Wisconsin. Was the first voucher program, which actually started out as a secular program. There were not religious schools included. At that time, I think there was maybe 250 students. Now we've obviously flipped things around where I think there's over 26,000 students in Milwaukee, and over 90% of those are attending religious schools. So it has evolved a bit from kind of a program that was intended to provide secular education to really now it's fundamentally to provide a religious education.
So here's a question that you guys might have an interesting take on from Thomas submits. I pay taxes. Why shouldn't I get to say where my taxes go? This is a common refrain we hear about from supporters of voucher schemes and public dollars going to support student choice to attend private schools or parents' choice to take their public dollars and send their kids to whatever schools they so choose. Why is this argument bad?
Right. I mean, I think there are a lot of stakeholders involved in making decisions on education. Obviously, a lot of people attend school board meetings or care about the schools in their community, and they pay to support those schools, including people, without school-age children or people who've had children who are not in our schools. So we agree that all these people should be involved, and we have a system for that. Those are our common schools. Those are our schools where we elect people to be on a board to make decisions about those schools. When we have taxpayer expenditures that go to some of these private schools, if we don't like how the school is being run, we can't change who's running it. We can't change what they're teaching, what their playground, whether they even have a playground. So there's a lot of decision making that goes out the window when we go to a voucher scheme where it's only the parent that matters, even though the rest of us are paying for these schools.
Right. And let's see. We had an anonymous question submitted, and we touched on this a little, but maybe, Patrick, you might want to give some more context. Do voucher schools do better than public schools? I think this is a common misperception that private schools are inevitably going to be more successful than public schools, and that public schools are failing and we are in crisis. But what's the reality? Right.
I mean, I guess just on the humorous side, I say we would know it if that was the case, because there's a lot of money going into funding studies about comparing whether these people really, really want this to work out, including our Secretary of Education. It's just not been borne out in the studies that have been conducted. So we know there's been studies on the DC voucher program. in Ohio, Louisiana. They've all shown basically that it's not any better than public schools, and in fact, on many subject areas has been tested worse. So there's really not evidence-based demonstrating that somehow this is a better scheme. You may find some studies that show there maybe are better graduation rates at some of the private schools, but that's kind of hard to compare to what it may take to graduate from one school compared to another. But really comprehensively, it's not, there's not a resounding yes that these are better in terms of an answer. I think oftentimes the answer is that they're not doing better in the places where it's been studied the most.
Right.
And Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong here, but for voucher advocates, it should be particularly discouraging that there isn't data showing that these schemes improve education for those receiving vouchers, especially when that's taking dollar for dollar money out of public schools, right? So you should see a steady decline in the performance at public schools when you implement voucher schemes. And if voucher schemes are hurting public schools and not performing better than the public schools, that's
a lose-lose.
Double problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, here's another question. Do voucher programs differ state to state, and how? And this was something I kind of alluded to in terms of different schemes that have been enacted to try and make these schemes sort of legally defensible state by state.
Right. There are obviously a lot of different models that states are using. One of the models originally was a pure, why we use the term voucher is a parent could send their student to the private school, and that would then get paid for via the state via a voucher. Now states are just doing direct payments to the schools themselves. So it is an antiquated term that way, but it describes really this process. The other means of funding private schools that we're seeing more common now in states is where it's not a pure voucher system, but money that would otherwise go into the state treasury is given to a scholarship organization, and they then pay the money to the private schools. And so one of the reasons for this is states like Arizona and Florida have very good constitutions. They don't allow public money to go to these schools. So in fact, they had to come up with a workaround to get around the voucher model. So we've seen that. That's what's being promoted federally. There are some bills to create a tax scholarship model federally, which is really money that any taxpayer would normally pay, or a corporation would pay to the government, is instead going to somebody else, and it's a dollar for dollar credit back instead of taxes that they don't have to pay. But really it's a public expenditure when you take that money away from that revenue that would otherwise be received.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong, high income earners in these schemes are incentivized to pay money, make donations into these scholarship funds rather than pay taxes on that large amount of money that would otherwise generate tax revenue for the state.
Right. It can actually be, there was a study that showed it can actually be profitable for a taxpayer to do that when they can get a federal tax deduction and then get a dollar for dollar credit from their state. So people have been pointing out that in states like, I think, South Carolina and Georgia, where people are immediately trying to get the tax payment because it's not really a donation. You actually are making money off of your payment.
Right. So we have a question here from Tessa McKenna asking, is it true that disabled students can be treated unfairly in voucher schools, and how? And we talked a little bit about lack of oversight, but maybe we can talk more about that.
So the reality is that in private schools, students with special needs might not be treated at all. There's no obligation that these schools accept students with special needs. And the ones that do, we've seen some pretty disturbing anecdotal evidence that they're not being given the same sorts of resources or comparable resources to what they would be getting in public schools.
And even where it is mandated that they accept students with disabilities, this was a problem in Milwaukee. Parents were complaining that they were discouraged or weren't providing adequate resources for the student to get an education. So the Department of Justice actually opened an investigation over some of the voucher schools in Milwaukee and how students were treated. They're not mandated to provide a free and appropriate education under IDEA like all public schools are. And it's certainly a big cost to public schools to provide that education to all students. The voucher schools can accept students that don't require that level of cost and care, and then leave this kind of hole for public schools, take money from them, and then they can't adequately teach all students. So again, it's been a problem, and even if it's mandated by law, there are ways for the schools to discourage families in terms of not actually providing the needs that the students has.
Right. Let's see. I'm going to fold these two questions together. Why are you so mad about vouchers? Have they ever done anything negative anyway? And I want my kid to have every opportunity. Why don't you want my child to have more choices? So can we talk any more about some maybe specific examples or maybe larger trends about what's the negative impact of school vouchers, especially being framed as broader choices for students? What do you guys think?
This American Life just came out with a great episode about Betsy DeVos, our Education Secretary DeVos, her outlook on the education system, and it sort of speaks to that question of I want my child to have every opportunity. And what the voucher scheme does is it speaks to specific students and helping one individual student, escape the public school system and maybe have a chance at a different type of education, though the data doesn't support that education is any better. That's a scheme that cannot be sustained if you ramp it up for every child, right? I totally get the sentiment of I want my child to have the best education possible, but if you try to do that for every single child through vouchers, the voucher system would fail. It's the public education system that's able to best serve
the most number of students.
I mean, I also think it's a misnomer, that this choice terminology, if you hear two people talking about the same topic, you'll hear one side talk about choice and one side talk about vouchers. For many people, it's not a choice. They've already made the choice, usually on a religious basis, to send their child to a certain school. What we found in Wisconsin when we went with a statewide voucher program, 75% of the students who participated already attended a private school. So it's not as if students who are otherwise attending public schools are now given more options. It's people had already made the decision. They don't like something about how the public school is doing it. I think also if we're talking about choices, and this is something, people have the option to attend private schools. People can donate to scholarship organizations. Religious schools can collect more from their congregations to pay for religious education. But it becomes a problem when communities are propping up and supporting religious schools, and there are parents who want to send students there, but that should be a private obligation, not a public obligation for all of us to cover.
Right. Okay. So here's a question that's a little bit complicated, but we can give it a shot. Do you think the trend in polls showing a decline in Christianity on the whole, as well as a large proportion of evangelical white Christian declining at an even faster pace, is possibly driving these types of school voucher schemes and their expansion or attempted expansion? What do we think are the reasons why these programs seem to be expanding and getting national attention and a national push?
Yeah. So the first half of that question is pretty exciting news for the secular movement, which is just that Christianity in the country and evangelical Christianity is on the decline. Secularism is on the rise. We're up to 24% nationally identify as non-religious, which includes people who identify as atheists, agnostics, secular, or just don't affiliate with any mainstream religion. It's good to see that more people in this age of information are able to live their lives free from superstition.
The connection is probably hard to know. In reality, is this decline contributing? I think we see that just from our own observations, I guess, in that, sometimes when there's a pushback on something, when gay marriage becomes legalized, there's a recurring pushback. And so I think to some extent that maybe what's going on is that people view public schools as secular schools and as the enemy in some sense. You're teaching my child evolution, which violates my religious beliefs. So they really do think at a fundamental level that a public school is somehow an evil thing. I think that's not borne out in any surveys of parents who send their students to public schools. They like their public schools as much as they do get vilified, and as much as there are other improvements that are being explored in this country. But I think it wouldn't surprise me if there is some pushback if this view is, there are people in the U.S. who aren't all Christians. There's more pluralism. There's more people who aren't religious, and somehow that's a bad thing. We hear it from like the governor of Kentucky or Mike Huckabee saying, we took prayer out of schools, bad things happen. They view this as somehow a moral, immoral thing that must be stopped, that schools aren't pushing religion on kids.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think from a broad perspective, voucher schemes are one tool in the tool belt of the evangelical movement, which is trying to push Christianity on a public that more and more does not want it. So yes, we're seeing this in other arenas that FFRF deals in as well, where the more secular community becomes, the more clamor there is from the evangelicals to push Christianity on that secular institution.
Right. And certainly, as Patrick pointed out, when we see who is behind a lot of these proposals really pushing it and lobbying for it, it's usually these large organized religious institutions, and that really is a clue as to what's driving it and what the true purpose is of it. So I just want to maybe end with, you guys have talked about how you've lobbied on this issue in DC in front of Congress, and we're always lobbying and doing grassroots lobbying to state legislatures about these issues. Why is it important, and what can citizens do in terms of stopping these voucher programs?
I think they can certainly reach out to their representative, whether if it's a state that's proposing it or, nationally. We saw in a very short time span, just last week, the state of Illinois approved a tax voucher scheme, and if they had full feedback from a lot of constituents, probably would have never happened. However, there's unique education budget that had to get passed, and so there wasn't a lot of time for people to reach out. So I would say do it even before there's a bill, because people need to know, oh, my constituents don't support this type of program.
Right.
This is hugely important. I want to echo Patrick and say specifically, contact your representative is probably a thing that people hear often, but actually do it. They're all accessible. They all have phone lines and email addresses, and they really do respond to what constituents say. This is not like, oh, I'll get around to it. Do it now. Do it.
And like Patrick said earlier, your representatives are actually probably not dogmatic on this issue. They are open to hearing that their constituents support public schools, that they want their representatives to support public schools, and whether you think they're conservative or not, they probably are open to hearing what you think about public money going to support private and particularly religious schools. So speak up and share this information with the people that support public schools. And it looks like that does it for questions from Facebook. So again, please support public schools, oppose the expansion of vouchers in any way that you can, and thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next week for another installment of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.